association with others, I have to feel my difference, my separation from others, in order to sense the need to reach out to them, to show solidarity with their plight as an equal. As we shall see, pity presupposes that the self and the other never form a common being, but exist in common only through mutual differentiation. The constitutive force of difference and separation for human identification means that the community imagined by the social contract does not come about through the fusion of individuals into an organic whole founded on the recognition of some collective essence. This undermines the view adopted by Andrew Norris, one of Nancy's critics, in his article Nancy and the Myth of Community, that the political theory which is most obviously attacked in Nancy's critique of community as shared identity is that of Rousseau's, and particularly his idea of the general will. Norris misconceives the general will as the fulfilment of an immanent common self, cleansed, he writes, of all difference. Rousseau never assumes a common being which the general will releases and puts to work to build a closed identarian community. The general will starts from the premise that there is no essential belonging among us. The need, Rousseau argues, for a consciously willed contract between the citizen and the community of which that citizen forms a part, a contract based on reciprocal rights and mutual obligations, would become redundant if there was natural unity. Rousseau writes, "As there is no natural or general society among men, we must make up for the lack of general association by creating new associations." For Rousseau, we think about what we share in common only because of differences and disagreements. He writes in the social contract in relation to the general will, if there were not any different interests, the common interest would hardly exist and would never encounter any obstacle. All would go on of its own accord and politics would cease to be an art. The general will never establishes a community cleansed of all difference, as Norris wrongly asserts, but accepts different opinions and opposing identities as the base of its existence. If we could produce an organic whole, argues Rousseau, politics would cease to be an art. The contingency of the general will, its lack of natural grounding, being grounded on the absence of any general or natural society, any general association, explains why Rousseau conceives it not as a total state, but as an act of continual willing, whereby citizens periodically scrutinise and revise their decision about what counts as the common. The general will can never be fully grasped or embodied in any law or institution. It consists of will itself and therefore remains open-ended. We can always will new terms or agreements through which we understand our commonality. If we take the laws for granted, that is, as a full embodiment of the general will, the state, writes Rousseau, is dead. The general will would cancel itself out if it could will itself as a totality, because, put quite simply, citizens would no longer have anything left to will. And the contract, as a consciously willed agreement based on reciprocal rights and duties, would thereby become irrelevant. The finite character of the general will, its lack of essence or finality, entails an infinite act of willing. The general will, to function effectively, presupposes a self-critical mode of community, a non-conformist type of citizenship. Rousseau writes in The Social Contract, "If the people simply promises to obey, by that very act it dissolves itself and loses what makes it a people." To prevent political stagnation and apathy, To get the people to think critically about its own self-representation, citizens must remain sensitive to what the current definition of the general will excludes. Freedom and equality provide the founding principles of the state, Rousseau affirms. However, if the general will, being constructed out of differences and oppositions, can never claim full generality, then the citizens' commitment to those principles cannot simply involve identification with or obedience to the current order, but must entail openness to those voices or demands muffled by the state, and which question how free and equal the community actually is. It entails a type of citizenship which acknowledges the impossibility of founding the state as a harmonious whole, but does not live that impossibility as a reason to accept inequality, oppression and injustice as inevitable. Recognising social contingency itself is not enough to engender contestation and change. We need to experience that contingency as a call to action, as creating the possibility of transformation. So the social contract is not a state, but an act of continuous contracting, which involves a similar notion of politics to the one that Nancy calls for in his inoperative community, a politics that does not stem from a will to realise an essence. The way Rousseau theorises pity could help us understand the kinds of commitments this continual process of contracting might involve. Pity should foster identification with the socially marginalised and excluded, who alert us to the incompleteness of the current order and its claim to universality. It should incite us to recognise the struggle of those the state refuses to recognise as a common concern. For in the absence of any higher authority for the social contract, the state ultimately belongs to the citizens that live there. And as the authority of that state, they remain responsible for ensuring its legitimacy. Citizens cannot turn away from inequality and domination without neglecting their civic duty. The contract involves a mutual undertaking, whereby citizens learn they cannot work for others, Rousseau writes, without working for themselves. We need a contractual agreement between the self and the community only because the potential for conflict, disagreement and ambiguity persevere. The agreement and the mutual undertaking it involves would become redundant if there was no threat of its betrayal. Citizens need to recognise that threat as reinforcing the need to remain responsible for and responsive to their community, whose legitimacy remains always in question. Pity supports the contractual relation because it rests on the understanding of self and other as interdependent but not reducible to one another. Catherine Furzer states in Nietzsche and Rousseau, pity is the potent expression of the divided self. Pity as a vital component of our moral dimension excludes the possibility of a closed and undivided individual, totally disconnected from others. In the hypothetical state of nature, pity functions negatively, as a brake on the potential excesses of our instinct of self-preservation. It is nothing more than the refusal of violence and conflict. Natural pity implies a primordial openness to others, which does not produce any form of association or lasting relation, because natural man's non-differentiation from his environment, his purely physical existence, makes comparison and by default identification impossible. Pity becomes socialised when we sense our difference from others. It is activated by imagination, relying on our ability to objectify ourselves, to imagine ourselves simultaneously as self and other. It therefore depends on division. Rousseau asks, how are we moved to pity? By getting outside ourselves and identifying with a being who suffers. We only suffer as much as we believe him to suffer. It is not in ourselves, but in him that we suffer. Compassion does not involve our immediately feeling the other's pain. Such immediacy would foreclose all self-other awareness, and consequently any feeling of necessity to associate or feel solidarity with that other. The other's suffering is not reabsorbed within the self, nor does it produce fusion or communion, but is experienced as otherness from within. Pity disrupts the illusion of a self-contained individual and potentially gives us a feeling of being outside ourselves from within the intimacy of the self. The experience of otherness from within proves central for transforming pity into a dynamic force, since it suspends our sense of identity and gives us a sense of its incompleteness. It opens us to that which goes beyond how we understand ourselves and our position within the social field. It exposes the other's suffering as present to us in its absence. The simultaneous absence and presence of suffering prompts us to imagine our potential to suffer like those we pity, our shared vulnerability as the basis of our deep equality with them, and also to acknowledge our freedom from suffering as a mark of our strength to help the other in their plight, to overcome the inequality which their suffering represents. Relating to others presupposes both an openness to and difference from them. Compassionate identification rests on a degree of non-identification, or on the impossibility of absolute identification, which would close the space of the in-between, the space of the community, or space of community in which political action can occur. We share otherness, not identity. The feeling of pity does not automatically assume political and ethical import. It needs to involve reason and abstraction, the ability to generalise. Its critical force relies on a movement from the particular to the general, from the self to humanity. Each particular case of suffering and fragility only works as a call to solidarity and political action if taken as a violation of our universal equality with one another. Otherwise, we could misinterpret our freedom from suffering as a sign of imagined self-sufficiency, as our right to ignore the other. However, for Rousseau, the denial of others, the ability to blind ourselves to their suffering, to read their disenfranchised situation as confirmation of our superiority, can never be total. To deny others also demonstrates our potential to acknowledge them, for we can only deny them because we have acknowledged them at some point. Pity also loses its ethical and political dimension when taken as a pure feeling, as an end in itself, when we do not experience the other's suffering as exposing the gap between what is and what should be, the gap which inaugurates all ethical and political action. Rousseau refers to the sterile displays of pity of theatre audiences, to the tyrannical Roman emperors who can weep at fictional evils but continue to commit daily atrocities. Rousseau writes, "These emotions are pure and without anxiety for ourselves. In giving our tears to fictions, we've satisfied all the rights of humanity without having to give anything of ourselves." The imaginary sense of completion, of satisfaction and fulfilment stops the critical force of pity by giving us an impression of a self fully reconciled with the world. It does not produce anxiety in us. It does not